Happy Wednesday, my friends. Mary Rose here, waving a special hello to those of you who are watching on Facebook, because there's something you must do. Go to StreamYard.com/Facebook, permission to show your name. I think you all know how to do that by now, but it never hurts to remind. Greetings to all. It is Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific time. I'm Mary Rose Wood. This is when I go live to talk about stuff that is relevant to writers. Today's topic is, drumroll, rimshot, comedy. Now, this is really the only word that applies to this is chutzpah, because it takes chutzpah, by which I mean an excess of nerve, to actually try to explain comedy. Many have tried. I'm going to add my well-intentioned words to the mix today. But I hope that you all are in the mood for an exploratory conversation, because there are no scientific answers. This isn't a math problem about comedy. When you think of the questions that come up, what makes something funny? Are some things not good to joke about? How can we tell if something's funny? How can we be funnier? Are we funny? Is there a way to know if we're being funny? These are eternal questions about comedy. So we're going to do our best to explore. So before we get started, a couple of things. First of all, I very much want to say hello to all of you who are here live. I see a bunch of you here. Hey, Erin, lovely to see you. Molly, it's wonderful to see you. Jay is here. And if I'm not mistaken, Jay, you might have been the one that asked for this topic. I had it on a list of requests and I didn't have your name next to it. But in my mind, I think you're the one that asked for me to talk about comedy. Terry Finn is here. Lovely to see you. And Nancy is here. And Sarah is here. And Cynthia is here. And oh, so many are here. Thumbs up indeed to all of you. If anyone's new to the live stream, I'm Mary Rosewood. And I want to say I'm best known for my attempts to be funny. I have written quite a bit of comedy and have some background in the comic arts, and I'm fascinated by it. This is really a topic that's near and dear to my heart. But I am best known as an author of middle grade fiction. And I'm also the founder of Path of the Storyteller. And if anybody who's out there wants to know more about Path of the Storyteller, please get on the mailing list. Just go over to the website, www.pathofthestoryteller.com, and put your name in the opt-in box to be on the mailing list. Every week you'll hear from me with some invitation to think about and talk about something at these live streams. And occasionally I'll be offering specific trainings. I'm working on a new training right now that I'm very excited about. And the people who are on my mailing list are going to get the first look at it. So that's just an invitation to join the mailing list. I would love to have you there. I'd like to know who's listening. All right. Hey, Constanza is here. Wonderful to see you, Constanza. I'm glad. I know we're getting close to bedtime where you are. Really glad you could be here live. All right. Feel free to ask questions and pose your own thoughts and insights about this hilarious topic of comedy. It's very flattering. I have to say, it's very flattering to be asked to talk about comedy, because it is very hard to explain. It's the old joke, you know, we can't really describe it, but we know it when we see it. And in a sense, we know it when we laugh at it. Like if we find something funny, we find it funny. We can't not find it funny. It just happens, which gives us this feeling of like it being a reflex, almost like a sneeze, right? Which makes it kind of mysterious. And it makes me wonder, right, if there is far more neuroscience about comedy that we've yet to unravel. So today we're just going to be exploring. I'm going to be sharing from my own experience of pondering, studying, and writing comedy. But it is an exploratory talk, and there's nothing I say today is meant to be like, you know, a proven prescription about comedy. But it's a timely topic for a couple of reasons, one lighthearted and one less so. This past weekend, actually, the new season of a show on Amazon called The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel was released. The first 2 episodes were released. And this is a show, if you're not familiar with it, about a woman who wants to be a stand-up comic. And so it's very much about the comedy business, about all of the struggle to be funny. In this particular case, she's a woman living in a time in New York where women were not encouraged to be comics. So she's got to struggle against some opposition. The cultural norms of her family don't support her being a comic. But you know, what's the real obstacle to being a comic? If you tell a joke and it's not funny, that's as the, you know, comedy uses a lot of violent words. When a comic does well, they say, I killed it, you know, when they were when they flop, it's like it was dead. So the stakes are very high. So in honor of the return of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which is a show I enjoy tremendously, it's a timely topic. And the other reason that it's a timely topic, I think, if you'll indulge me for getting serious in this comedy talk, is that today is a really heavy day for many of us who are watching the news. There's this will be on YouTube and Facebook forever, but just to put this in context, I'm recording this live on February 23rd, 2022, and it's been a rough news week so far, and there are breaking news items coming out almost hourly as we sit here and watch a situation unfold in Europe, the long-awaited and long-dreaded invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It's unsettling, and there's lots to say about it. It's serious stuff, and yet one of the things that I'm going to propose by the end of this talk is that it's the serious things that are hard to talk about and hard to look square in the face that make comedy extra necessary. All right. So in light of all of that, I am going to do my best to talk about comedy. Now, comedy is not a new thing. It was not invented by 20th century, you know, comics on the radio. It wasn't invented by vaudeville. It wasn't, you know, it's been part of human beings, much the same way you've heard me talk about storytelling being part of human beings. It just seems that people have always had a sense of humor, which is fantastic. I did a very cursory bit of research, and there are apparently, you know, ancient Egyptian fart jokes and hieroglyphics on the walls of tombs. Go for it, right? This is, we think they're jokes. I mean, the cultural context that makes something funny might be a little off. Maybe we don't really know what they were talking about, but they find evidence of humor even in very, very ancient sources. I will talk from the Western tradition because that's what I know best, but I'm sure that with some research, you could find all kinds of goodies about the history of comedy. So in the Western tradition, what we talk about formally as comedy goes back, as so many of our narrative arts do, to the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks had a competitive theater scene. In other words, they had playwrights that wrote plays that were in part of contests, and they would, you know, all the plays would get done, and the people would pick a winner, you know, kind of like America's Got Talent, right? You know, there's like, it's a competition, how good you are. And there were tragedies and there were comedies. So this goes back now, you know, 500 BC or so. I'm going to do sort of rough numbers here. But what I wanted to point out about the Greek comedies is that they were very aggressive and very smart in that the writers were not simply trying to entertain. So actually right away, we leap into this theme of the role that comedy plays in society. They were not just telling jokes like stand-ups trying to get an easy laugh, like the kinds of bad stand-ups that are the bane of the existence of Midge Maisel in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, you know, this kind of glib, cheap jokes that are just designed to get an easy laugh out of undiscerning, you know, inebriated patrons. The Greek comedies were satirical. They poked fun at targets that were recognizable. They poked fun at the politics of the day. They poked fun at particular philosophers. Like one philosopher would write a comic play making fun of some rival philosopher. they really went at each other in these comedies. And so the work themselves were aggressive, and then there was a sense of competition of trying to please the audience. So you see right away that comedy is it's a lighthearted word, oh, comedy, but it's got some punch to it. It's got edge to it, even from the beginning. Like everything that the Greeks did, the Romans appropriated it and made it their own. So fast forward a couple of centuries, now we're in the Roman Empire, and the Roman comedies are really, really influential in a way that I think you're going to recognize as soon as I start talking about them. The two most well-known Roman playwrights were Terence and Plautus, and their comedies were full of things like bad puns, lots of dirty jokes, lots of off-color humor, scenes where there would be doors on stage, like a lot of doors, multiple apartments or multiple entrances to a house or on a street that had houses adjacent. And the doors would be opening and closing all the time because characters would be coming in and going out and coming in and going out. Lots of physical comedy, what we would nowadays call slapstick. All right. So right away, you're getting a feeling of like, is this a Roman comedy or is it an episode of Friends, right? It starts to feel familiar in a way. But this is what they found funny, and this is what they wrote about. They also had character types that appeared very frequently in play after play after play. And some of these character types, again, might feel familiar. There were often like kind of dopey ingenue lovers, some kind of romance between two characters that, might be of the upper classes, but maybe not that bright. And then the brains of the outfit was often some sidekick who was really clever, who kind of helped arrange things. In the Roman comedies, this clever sidekick to the dopey ingenue lover was often the household slave. This was a slave owning society. And I'm going to talk in a minute about where the comedy comes from and putting characters like that together. Other character types that date back to the Roman comedy is a kind of exaggerated masculine character, like the braggart soldier, they called him, Miles Gloriosus, like somebody who was just this big, muscle-bound guy who was just full of himself, really vain, the strongest guy in the room, and everybody would like ooh and ah over him. Think of the character of Gaston in Beauty and the Beast, for example, and you have a very good contemporary example of this type. Another set of character types that are often seen in Roman comedies are like the old man, the obnoxious old man, often lecherous old man. So kind of inappropriate old guy. And another one would be like a domineering mother-in-law or a domineering mother. So I mentioned as an example of the braggart soldier, the character of Gaston in Beauty and the Beast, but think about this couple that I just described, this obnoxious old man and the domineering older woman. Think of for example, the characters of Midge Maisel's in-laws and The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, if you know that. If you don't know it, perhaps you know Seinfeld, the characters of the Costanzas, the parents in Seinfeld. You can see that these types are very recognizable even to audiences thousands of years later. I didn't give an example about the male ingenue with the clever sidekick who was a slave, but the most pointed example that one can give, of course, is look at the character of Harry Potter and Dobby in the Harry Potter series. They function very much like this. Harry is not a purely comic figure, nor is he purely the ingenue in a love story, but he does move in and out of those roles over the course of that long series. But they have that kind of relationship, right? So you can easily say, and you would be right to say so, that these are very old tropes, cliches, right? They're not, they don't feel fresh. But I have to say that if you took them out, if you remove them, along with them, you would be removing, half of the sitcom television of the 20th century and lots of more contemporary characters as well. The essence of these tropes can be found everywhere in contemporary comic writing. All right. So just know that's sort of my first takeaway here. Comedy has its traditions. It has its traditions. There are things that we have been finding funny for thousands of years. Think about it. All right. Now, what is comedy? What makes something funny? Let's pivot to that question. Let's go after the big gorilla in the room. I'm going to give it to you in a simple way that makes sense to me. To me, comedy is mostly the art of juxtaposition. It's the art of putting things next to each other in a surprising way. So you could even say it's the art of surprise and juxtaposition, right? We weren't expecting to see these two things, these two ideas, these two characters put together in quite this way. And it pleases us. It surprises us. The contrast between them surprises us. Let me give you a few examples of how this idea of surprising juxtaposition ends up feeling funny to the audience. I mentioned the Greek comedies being full of satire, right? Other words for this type of comedy would be parody or caricature. In other words, I'm talking about the sorts of comedy that is based on exaggeration of something recognizable. Now, you can look every day in the magazines and the newspapers and see, I hope you can still see lots of good political cartoons. You can see, let's see, a recent film that is absolutely a satire, the Netflix comedy Don't Look Up. So these are examples. Parody is a kind of almost like a close retelling of something familiar, but so exaggerated as to become comical. There's a show on, somebody help me with the right title because I haven't seen it, but I know it's on right now. It's the woman in the wind across the street from the girl in the window. Like, you know what I'm talking about. So it's making fun of a particular type of female-driven thriller. That's parody. So caricature, satire, and parody exaggerate something that we recognize, and they exaggerate it in a way that we find funny. And what is being juxtaposed here? The original, right, the familiar with what's unfamiliar, which is the exaggeration. So it's in that space where it becomes new, where the exaggeration makes the familiar thing new to us, that the comedy gets released. If we didn't recognize what it was making fun of, we would lose most of the humor, right? We would lose a lot of it. We wouldn't appreciate it. So this kind of humor depends on us bringing to the table a kind of cultural information that we're familiar with what's being parodied or what the satire is all about. So that's an example of juxtaposing the familiar with the unfamiliar through exaggeration. This is one of the most effective ones. It's so common. It's so funny, and it's everywhere. And this is a juxtaposition of high status and low status. Now, we live, of course, in a society where we like to think that we're less status driven than we really are. We may not have an inherited nobility and royal family in the United States, but we certainly have status. And we measure it in all kinds of ways. And so the comedy that arises from taking something that indicates high status and like bringing it low is endlessly hilarious. Or inserting the energy of what is considered low status behavior into a high status environment. I want to talk about this a little bit because it's very much connected to an archetypal energy that we talk about in the Path of the Storyteller training called the trickster energy. And the archetype of the trickster is all about sticking a pin in the ego, right? Of bringing the high status, excessively rigid egos, the overblown egos, and just bringing them down a peg. That's what the trickster energy is for. There is tremendous release of comedy when the balloon of the high status person is popped. The slapstick cliche of a well-dressed man in a suit or even a tuxedo walking down the street and slipping on a banana peel and falling is a really classic visual example of how physical comedy and slapstick often turn on this juxtaposition of status, of social status. I recently had the treat of seeing a production of My Fair Lady. And one of the funniest scenes in My Fair Lady is when the character of Eliza Doolittle, and of course, this is an entire play about the collision of high status and low status. So the character of Eliza Doolittle, who we've met at the beginning, she is a Cockney flower girl, with a dirty face and speaks in the lowest dialect, like the real dialect of the lower classes in London. And this pompous fellow named Henry Higgins, who happens to be an expert on dialects, has a bet with a friend, one of his upper class friends, that he can, by changing her dialect, by changing the way she speaks, he can get Eliza to pass as royalty. And he trains her and he trains her and he trains her, and much hilarity ensues. I'm sure most of you know it. But the scene that I'm talking about is one of the first tests, if you will, that he gives to Eliza after she's been practicing a lot and is able to participate in conversations with, she's learned some manners, she's got some phrases that she can pronounce like a highborn lady. She's far from being a finished work. She's still a work in progress, but she's got some stuff that she can use. He brings her to the horse races, where everyone in society is there and they're all very restrained and they're dressed in a certain way. And of course, Eliza's behavior at the horse race is not the way. She gets excited because her horse is going to win, and she famously shouts encouragement using a vulgarity at the horse to move its bloomin' arse, and everyone is aghast. But that's the great joke of the scene, is that she's trying really hard to behave the way she thinks she's supposed to behave, but ultimately the excitement just takes her, takes control. So when Eliza Doolittle shouts, "Move your bloomin' arse," at her horse that she's got money on, the place erupts in laughter. It's just a great example of the juxtaposition. It doesn't have to be class-based. Anytime there's dignity at stake, if the dignity becomes unraveled somehow, then that's trickster energy at work, and we often find it funny. If you think of some of the great examples of physical comedy, Lucille Ball in the dancing in the wine grapes, the vat of grapes, and doing this stuff. It's a person losing their dignity, right? And they're just losing their dignity because the physical environment is just, it's overwhelming them. There's no way to hold it together. You can't be dignified in a situation like this. So this trickster energy is really, really, really powerful. I think about it a lot because most of us go through life trying to hold our dignity together and trying to, aspire to some social position we want to be thought well of. And the trickster energy just won't let us off the hook. It forces us to look in the mirror. So a great deal of comic energy is generated by the trickster. All right, here's another example of juxtapositions. Odd Couples. There are so many funny teams. In fact, if you just think of comedy teams, I bet you can all think of a ton, whether it's Abbott and Costello, Laurel and Hardy, George Burns and Gracie, Lucille Ball and, Desi Arnaz. Over and over and over again, we see couples that are funny together. If you like Neil Simon, you probably know The Odd Couple, which was made into both a film and a long-running successful television series. And it's the juxtaposition of people who are unlike each other that creates this incredible opportunity for ongoing comedy. You've got the character of Felix, who's very anxious, very tidy, like obsessively neat. And then he's got his friend, Oscar, who is just a slob, and they have to live together, and much hilarity ensues, right? This kind of contrast also works in a kind of a classic rom-com plot, when you have two people who meet and they seem like they don't like each other, and it's all hostility, and yet there's this understanding that they're, in a sense, attracted to each other. The great warring lovers of romantic comedy in my book are, of course, Beatrice and Benedict of Much Ado About Nothing. So you see how that there's lots of fun, hilarious scenes. There's so much funny. That's why they call it rom-com. It's romance and comedy, because when you juxtapose difference, you get two things, right? You get comedy, and sometimes you also get chemistry. So that's rom-com. Another great comic example to me, and again, I might be talking past the sell-by date of those of you who are younger than I am, but the Smothers Brothers, who were a really, really great comedy team. They were brothers. They were musicians. They were comics. They were their own special thing. And one of the conceits that they used in their act is that one of the brothers was quite smart and authoritative and had kind of dignity about him, and the other brother was just this wide-eyed innocent and said dumb things and had to be corrected all the time. But at the end of every bit, who ended up with the upper hand? The dumb one, right? And that was just one of the ongoing comic rhythms that they used, and it was never not funny. They were hilarious. They did a lot of political humor, a lot of humor that had a lot of edge. They actually struggled a bit with the networks, and there's a really, really interesting story about the Smothers Brothers' career. But I just want you to think about that cycle of one of them has dignity, one of them is authority. He feels that he's almost doing his brother a favor, continually correcting him and letting him know what to do. And the wide-eyed, naive character ends up often being the one who gets the last word. That's trickster energy at work. You can also see like an identity switch plots. I think of the Freaky Friday and all of those plots where people switch bodies, and the mom has to end up going through life as the teenage daughter, and the teenage daughter has to end up going through life as the mom, and they learn about each other. You could talk about those as real stories with journeys of transformation, but they're comedies. They're comic stories. And the comedy is baked into the premise because the premise involves juxtaposition and surprise. So that's the whole subject of juxtaposition, social status, playing with social status, and putting things together for comic relief using that trickster energy. If you think about it, you're going to see it everywhere. The last thing I wanted to say in terms of stuff that really matters in comedy is the auditory quality, which is interesting, right? Because most of you are fiction writers where, you're not doing stand-up. You're not necessarily writing comedy that's going to be performed, which I want to talk about. But puns and wordplay are an eternal source of comedy. People like the surprise of hearing things that sound funny. And what sounds funny to people, guess what? Has to do with juxtaposition and surprise. If we make a pun, what are we juxtaposing? We're using a word that could potentially mean two different things, and we're using it in a way that our listener is expecting us to use it to mean one thing, but then at the last minute we swerve and it actually means the other thing. It's juxtaposition and surprise. We're juxtaposing the two meanings of the word, and we're creating a kind of a little bit of a surprise. So anytime you're using puns and wordplay, it's really just like a verbal type of juxtaposition and surprise. But some words have a funny sound to them. I watched a little YouTube video where Jerry Seinfeld spoke very seriously, no kidding, very, very amusingly, about trying to write a joke about a Pop-Tart. And one of the reasons he wanted to write a joke about a Pop-Tart is that he found the word Pop-Tart funny. He just thought it was inherently funny. I can't disagree. As soon as you start talking about Pop-Tarts, we're in a comic register. And just know that that is something that people really respond to. Mel Brooks, a great comic guru, famously talked about how all words with the letter K were funny. The letter K is the funniest letter. If you say pickle, it's funny, you know. Maybe that's why knock knock jokes are so funny. They have the K sound in them. So while we're talking about that, there's the sounds of words, and wordplay can also be a great source of humor, but rhythm is key. And another comment from Mr. Seinfeld was that when you're writing jokes, you have to think like a songwriter, because if it's one syllable too long, you've ruined it. It has to be just right. Now, good writing is concise, and my students know that I talk about this in general. But when you're trying to get a laugh, when you're trying to be funny, being concise is essential. Essential. It's all in the timing, as Terry Finn noted recently, right? I think you posted that in the Facebook group. It's all in the timing with humor. And why do you suppose that is? We can't surprise our listener if they get to the punchline before we do, right? If they figure out the joke before we tell it. We are in a race. When we're doing comedy, we're in a race with our readers. If we're doing it live, we're in a race with the audience. If they get to the punchline before we do, the joke falls flat. And this is one of the reasons that comedy must be so precise. So, rhythm, conciseness, the auditory quality, trickster energy, odd couples, the juxtaposition of high status and low status, the use of exaggeration. These are things that we use to be funny. Now, here's where I want to go with this now. Most of you, as I said a minute ago, are not stand-up comics. You're writing fiction. And when we are telling a joke, or when we've written a joke and it's performed in front of a live audience, they either laugh or they don't. If they laugh, the joke is funny. If nobody laughs, the joke's not working. And stand-up comics know this, and they are ferocious in terms of having to develop their material. How often do I tell my writing students that you have to work on it more than you think you do? That you have to be more fierce in your revisions than you might think you have to be. You can't stop working on it until it works. Here's the thing. For us fiction writers, knowing when it works is not easy. If we were stand-up comics and we told jokes that bombed, then we would know the joke's not good enough yet. Maybe it'll never be good enough. We'll work on it. We'll keep trying it out. We'll do it night after night until we make it work. But if it never works, we cut it. We might write 100 jokes to get to the 10 that are our signature jokes, right? So the work of the stand-up is quite admirable, in my opinion. No matter what you think of stand-up comedy in general, you have to admire the work ethic, because they don't quit until the joke gets a laugh. The joke doesn't get a laugh, it's got to go. So we can learn that from comics. We can all be that relentless. Now, how do we know if our own work is funny, though, if it's fiction? Well, this is a really interesting question. And I wanted to tell you one more thing, and I'm also looking at the comments. So if anybody's got questions that they want me to answer before we wrap up today, start putting them in the comments so that I can leave time for them. There's comedy with an audience, right? Comedy with a live audience and comedy without a live audience. So comedy with a live audience, I've been a playwright. I've done improv comedy on stage. It's thrilling when you are intending to be funny and the audience finds it so. It's a great feeling. And you know what works and what doesn't. And I was fortunate enough to spend 10 plus years in live performance doing stuff in front of actual humans. And you do develop a pretty good sense, right? You do develop it. And so when I began to write fiction, I went into it having honed my sense of comedy in front of an audience. And I'm grateful to this day that I did that. I'm not saying that all novelists who want to write comedy need to spend some time working on stage in front of an audience, although it wouldn't kill you, you know? And I think really most of us could benefit from taking an improv class or workshop. There's something about the commitment to being creative under pressure that we all can learn from as creative people. That's just a personal opinion of mine. But I wanted to talk about something that I learned in my brief research for this talk, which is we can go to a movie and a theater and hear laughter of our fellow attendees, but most of us are now watching stuff at home a lot, and so we are less. I mean, live comedy and theater is great, but we are all less likely to be watching comedy with others. We're far more likely to be watching it alone, and so thus our fellow writers in those arts who are used to being able to stand in the back of the movie theater to listen if something got a laugh, you know, they can't stand in the back of your living room as you stream Netflix to see if it gets a laugh. They're vulnerable the way novelists are vulnerable. And I wanted to tell you what I learned was that in the middle of the 20th century, television, which was the home of comedy, brought comedy into everybody's living room, right? This is the from radio comedy, radio show comedy to television comedy, that evolution. They originally did them with a live audience. They would perform these shows like little plays in front of a live audience, and so the audience would laugh, and that would be part of it. And it almost didn't occur to them, it seems to me, to try to do comedy without a live audience. It just they assumed if it's comedy, you need to have a live audience, and so they started to film all the original shows in front of a live audience. But this was, you know, expensive, and there were logistical problems. And if you know, sometimes, for example, if you were doing a show live is one thing, but then they started to do the shows on tape. So they would tape them live in front of a live audience, a live studio audience. You all know the phrase. And what if the actor forgets their lines and they have to do the same bit 2 or 3 times to get it on tape? Well, by the third time they do it, the audience has heard the joke 3 times, and so they're not going to keep laughing. So it's not a perfect system to tape with a live studio audience. And thus came the laugh track, this incredible invention. And I think we all know what a laugh track is, especially if you watch older shows, because they made abundant, excessive use of the laugh track in comic television in the middle of the 20th century, from about the late 1950s to the early 1970s. That was like the heyday of the canned laughter. And I always thought, oh, they put a laugh track on. Did you know that the laugh track was invented by one guy, and he basically controlled the laugh track market for all those years? If you wanted laughs to go on your show, you had to go to this guy. His name was Charlie Douglas. He kind of had the monopoly on the canned laughter business. Fascinating fun fact. So they would add pre-recorded laughter. And I wanted to say to you all, why did they feel it was so important that they had to pay this one guy to build this fancy machine, that they just had to have the pre-recorded laughter? They really believe that they have to have it. And what they felt was that it made things funnier, that things worked better if the people watching them heard other people laughing. And guess what? Like so many intuitive discoveries made by creative people, decades later, neuroscientists back it up. And what the neuroscientists have discovered is that laughter is literally contagious. You probably feel this in your own life experience. But when we're with people who are finding something funny, we're more likely to find it funny. And if we all find it funny, we're all more likely to find it funnier. Laughter is truly contagious. And so adding the canned laughter to these things actually did make them funnier. Now, what happened, of course, is that over time, it just became such a cliche. Everyone got exhausted by it. And so the audiences got weaned off it. The creative people basically said, enough of this. We don't like it. It's cheapening the work, and we'd like to try it without. And so gradually now it's become very rare to have a laugh track, although we still love to have our comedy shows in front of a live audience. And we still enjoy watching comedy with other people so we can share a laugh. It's not quite as funny, is it, when we're sitting by ourselves? So the fact that laughter is contagious leads me to a final conclusion that I want to make. And then I can see that I'm getting a question. I got a question from Jay that's very specific. I'll do my best, Jay, but I might not be able to give you exactly what you want because you're asking for. I'll just show what Jay's asking for. Jay's asking, the process of coming up with a party scene and Lady Constance face down in the dessert in the first Incarnable book, so hilarious. Yes, I know the exact scene that you're talking about. For me to talk about coming up with it right now, I would really have to think about it because it's been 11 or 12 years since I, in fact, did come up with that scene. But I'll tell you what, let me talk about the Incarnable Children books because there's a lot of examples of humor in them that are very much derived from exactly the points that I've been making today. So let me finish this point and we'll talk about the Incarnables just for a minute. And anybody else who has a question, please post it so I can totally leave time to address it. So if laughter is contagious, what that tells me, if I really think about it, is that comedy has the capacity to be persuasive. Because if you're laughing at something that's funny, and the fact that you're laughing at it makes me find it funny, you've just persuaded me. Being with you and laughing together at the same thing. Your laughter is contagious. I've caught it. Now we're both laughing at the same thing. We've persuaded each other that it's funny. We're even as we laugh at it, we're persuading each other that it's extra funny, that it's more funny than either one of us would find individually. There's something unifying about that. There's something unifying about it. So if something is persuasive, it has the capacity to change people's minds. And so all of a sudden, we're outside the realm of entertainment, right? We're outside the realm of pure diversion, which many people wrongly consider comedy pure diversion, a lesser art form. Anything that can persuade people and that can be a unifying force, that can change people's minds, is serious business indeed. And so I want to circle back just for a minute. In my introduction, I talked about how something really funny is happening this week because The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is releasing new episodes, and something really somber is happening this week, which is that we're seeing, even as I've been talking here, there may have been new developments. We're really sitting on the brink of it right now, the beginning of an invasion, of a ground war in Europe. So let's link those two ideas together. Some of the real classic comedy that endures has to do with very serious subjects indeed. And when I think of comedy that looks at the topic of war, I have to mention Dr. Strangelove, which is a 1964 film. I strongly recommend that if you've never seen it, that you watch it, or if you haven't watched it lately, that you watch it, because it is a comedy about nuclear war. And it was made during the Cold War, when nuclear war, and particularly between the US and the Soviet Union, was on everybody's mind. The potential for it was quite real. And yet we have comedy. Now, this was in the 1960s. What about before then? Well, Charlie Chaplin made a film called The Great Dictator that you can still watch. It was a comedy making fun of Hitler. It is a classic film, and it is funny, and it is also really serious. I think of another comic masterpiece film, which was the film MASH, later made into a long-running television series, which was set in the Korean conflict, but very much spoke to the American people about their experience being a nation at war in Vietnam. And of course, no discussion of comedy about serious topics is complete without mentioning the producers. Back to Mel Brooks, the comedy guru of all time, who created this film. It makes fun of a lot of things. I mean, the producers makes fun of Broadway, but the way it makes fun of Broadway is by, once again, making fun of the Nazis and making fun of Hitler. And Mel Brooks, is so, he's been asked about this so many times, and he's so clear in his response, because people ask him, did you get pushback of the comic way that you treated this character? And I'm quoting from some comments that Brooks gave in an interview to NPR at one point. And he said, did I get comments? Every rabbi in the world sent me a letter, he says. But his reply is, if you can make fun of him, if you can have people laugh at him, you win. That's the trickster energy at work, right? It's taking the pomposity, it's taking the grandiosity, the toxicity of that grandiosity and all the evil that resulted from it, and it's poking that trickster pin in that balloon and popping it. And Brooks is telling us that that's the job. And this is also a quote from Mel Brooks. He says, the comedy writer is the conscience of the king. He's got to tell him the truth. And that's my job, says Mel Brooks, to make terrible things entertaining. So there's a little bit of a thought about comedy for you. Now, let me go back to these questions. And I want you to really ponder that, what role comedy plays in your own work, whether you think about it as being entertainment or a break from the serious parts of your work, right? Or whether you think of comedy itself as being full of the storytelling energy, the kind that can, in a sense, persuade and unify in a way that sometimes a more direct and difficult treatment is hard, right? It's hard to watch, sometimes emotionally difficult to watch a straight depiction, documentary depiction of war. It's important, but it's difficult, right? And sometimes people resist what's difficult. But if we can use comedy to let people look at things that they might not otherwise be looking at, we are using it for a pretty high purpose, in my opinion. All right, so let's look at these questions in the minutes we have left. Now, so Jay asked me to talk a little bit about the Incarnable Children. Now, so this is a premise, right? These books are set in Victorian England, and it's a premise that has the juxtaposition of class structure, the bringing down of dignity baked into it, which is why the books are comedies. And the premise, for those of you that might not know the series, 6 books of middle grade. It's called The Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place. And the first book in the 6-book series is called The Mysterious Howling, just in case you're wondering what we're talking about. 3 children have been found living in the woods of this grand estate called Ashton Place. And the 3 children were, just based on their behavior, apparently raised by wolves. So they are feral, they're barking, they're howling, they're acting like wild wolf cubs. And so they are found by the hunting party, right? So really upper class type of activity by Lord Frederick Ashton, and they're captured and they're brought in. Now, what becomes of these children? The family advertises for a governess. And they don't say, we need someone to deal with 3 feral wolf-raised children, they say they want a governess to do all the things that a Victorian governess would do, which is teach Latin verbs, geography, music, and all that stuff. But they do say experience with animals strongly preferred. And so our hero, 15 years old at the start of the series, is Miss Penelope Lumley. And she doesn't know any of what I just told you. She shows up at this job interview thinking that this is going to be her first job. And she's going to have 3 children of this vast house. She assumes that they must be the children of the Ashtons. And that's the job. And she's offered the job right away. Even during the interview, through the windows of the parlor where she's being interviewed by Lady Constance, who's the young bride of Sir Frederick Ashton. And even Penelope notices during the interview that the Lady Constance herself seems too young to have 3 children already. I think she's 19. So there's a little bit of suspicion, but no one tells Penelope the truth because they want her to sign on the dotted line that she's going to take this job. She takes the job, but even as they're having the interview, she hears like weird howling sounds coming in, and she says, "What's that?" And everyone's like, "We don't hear anything." So she eventually goes to investigate. She finds the children and hidden in a barn where they've been locked away, and she realizes that these are the children she's been hired to teach, to raise, basically as the governess. So what do we have here? We have an extremely proper British governess, but even within her, there's a comic juxtaposition because she's only 15 years old. So her properness is a bit of an act. She's acting as if she is a qualified governess. She's putting on a bit of a show. So she's got a little bit of an ego, right? That she's portraying herself as being like a Mary Poppins, but she's a kid herself. And we also have the comic setup of this very elaborate household with servants and silver and hunting parties and the gentlemen's clubs, just upper class Victorian, playground here, having to deal with 3 feral children. And of course, the first thing that Penelope does is she says the children cannot live in the barn. They are going to come inside and live in the nursery like proper children. And so this is the premise. And so throughout the entire series, the collision between the social status, the sort of highbrow, striving of the Ashtons, and the absolute trickster chaos of these 3 children who see a squirrel and run after it like they want to catch it and tear it to shreds. Over and over and over again, this energy is released into the books. The scene that Jay particularly asked me to talk about is a kind of a climactic scene in the first book. What my students would know when I say it's the ordeal at the end of the second act, right? It's the scene where much as Eliza Doolittle is taken to the Derby to mingle with the other high society people at the horse race and try not to reveal that she's really a Cockney flower girl at heart, Penelope must take the 3 children to this very fancy Christmas ball that's being held in the house. And they have to perform, like they have to act like normal children. And she's done her best with them. And they have a lot of socially useful phrases. And, they've been taught to do a certain kind of dance. They've been taught how to behave. But we know as readers that this could go wrong at any second. At any second, they could be shouting like Eliza Doolittle, move your bloomin' arse, to their favorite horse. So that's not what happens. But of course, a squirrel does get lost in the ballroom and it all breaks loose. And so there's lots of comedy. Jay mentions that Lady Constance, during the course of this scene, this party ends up face down in the dessert. I think she gets a little tipsy, if I'm not mistaken. And so what do we want to do when we play with trickster energy? We want to elevate the low to the high, and we want to bring the high to the low. We want to keep playing with those juxtapositions. So as the children themselves continue to basically surprise everyone with how good they are and how kind they are, they're odd, right? They've got odd reflexes and they've strange habits and odd ways of talking. And yes, they do, decide to do a live reenactment of the wreck of the Hesperus because they really love poetry. You know, their social skills are unorthodox, but they're really good. They have really good hearts. And what we do in that scene is we show the children who, according to the people in the room, are maybe not fully human. Like they're the wolf children, right? This is the conceit, like, oh, these exotic pets of Lord Frederick Ashton. His friends are all fascinated because they've heard that he's got these, you know, strange wolf children. Are they human? Are they animals? Nobody's really sure. So they are inhabiting this very particular level of perception that they might not even be human. And all of these rich, moneyed, like high class people are the ones who are actually quite savage in the way they think. Lady Constance becomes an emblem of this because the more the children behave beautifully, the more she becomes sloppy and out of control and ends up passing out in her dessert, right? But all of this happens over the course of a fairly complicated scene. So that's why I kind of, I apologize, Jay, for not being able to share the process of coming up with the scene as you ask, but I can tell you what the dynamics of the scene are. And it's all about contrast and juxtaposition. It's about a scene where our characters have an extremely high stakes thing. This is a scene that was promised the reader, where it's revealed halfway through the book that the children it's like a command performance. They have to show up at this party and they've got to behave themselves. And the consequences are dire, you know, because if they don't behave themselves, Lady Constance is very likely to decide that they're not human at all. And she's going to either send them back to the forest or have them put in an orphanage, or, you know, she'll dispose of them in some way. But if they embarrass her, she's not going to want to keep them living in her house. So that's a lot of comedy woven into a scene that is actually the end of the second act and the cause of what happens after. Very good. Ellen has a question. Now, Ellen, I don't remember this character. Something from Carol Burnett, the Prony. I don't know what that character is, but if someone can remind me. But in general, yes, Carol Burnett was absolutely wonderful. Comic artist, still is. I think she's retired now, right? She was always getting hurt. Is that an example of trickster or slapstick? So a character who's always getting hurt. I don't remember the character you're talking about, Ellen, but I'm going to answer the question just in general. A character who's always getting hurt, like a cartoon character. That's what it makes me think of, right? There are cartoon characters who are always getting hurt. They're always getting, you know, blown up, right? Like Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. It's just one destruction after another, but because they're cartoon characters, they survive and they live to do another day. It's absolutely trickster energy. It's totally trickster energy. The character who's getting hurt is usually a character who needs to be brought down a peg. They're being outwitted. They're being bested by the trickster figure. Bugs Bunny is a great example, right? Nobody can get over on Bugs. These are the characters that just always outwit their adversaries. So that's what I take that to mean. Ask a follow-up question, though, if there was more to that. And oh, this is interesting. Ellen sharing that MASH and the Incorrigibles are family favorites right now. Listen, Ellen, I think that's fantastic. Your family, in my opinion, has really good taste. But I don't think I've ever heard those two works juxtaposed, to use my word of the day, before. So that gives me a lot of pleasure. All right, my friends, I don't see any other questions right now, but I hope that this talk has been of interest to you. And I really want to encourage you to think about using comedy. Don't assume that you're not funny or that you can't write comedy. I want you to use it. And if you do love comedy and you like to write it, I want you to use it not just as entertainment, but woven into the storytelling to provide this kind of opportunity to persuade, instruct, unify your readers in a way. There's a lot to be accomplished by the strategic use of comedy. So don't settle for just making jokes. You know, don't settle for writing what I call skits. all right, where you think, oh, well, it'll be funny if this happens. Like, it might be funny if that happens, but it still can happen for a reason that's of benefit to your overall storytelling and could maybe give your reader something to think about. And that's something that comedy can do really well, because it creates a safe space for us to look at hard things. Make sense? I hope so. All right, my friends, as ever, I'm very grateful for you coming live to listen to me talk about something that's, kind of hard to explain. And I hope it gave you something to think about. As ever, if you've got something that you want me to talk about in a future live stream, just leave it in the comments below the video. I really love hearing what you want me to talk about. We've got some great topics coming up based on your suggestions. So I really would love to hear more. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And yes, thank you all who are thanking me. I'm really grateful for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you next week.